Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on and having this very important discussion with me about your newest book, The End of Public Execution: Race, Religion, and Punishment in the American South.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
I'm really excited for it, simply because I've done a lot of mid 19th century research in my time, and I grew up 25 miles from Gettysburg, and so it was mid 19th century everything in my life, and kind of going from a military historian standpoint to a cultural historian, and then understanding the post war years is really my wheelhouse right now, and especially with race relations and such, and this book is really tapped into an area where I need to learn more about, and I definitely learned from you. This is your second book, right, Michael?
That's right.
Yeah, your first book was The Body in the Reservoir.
That's right. It's on murder and sensationalism in the South. So that one is a study of the press, really, and the narratives the press used to explain and to talk about sensationalized murder cases. And both of these books are studying the South. So you're right there on the border of the South, and you are engaged with issues of race. You know what I'm talking about. And so that first book, the last chapter of it was how these murder cases so often ended at the gallows. And that's how I first started thinking about capital punishment. And that led me into this book about public executions and the move to private executions.
With you personally, has this basically garnered a new interpretation of the history of capital punishment in America, or did you have some kind of a notion of, I know this is like this, but I want to learn more, or was it something where it was just different?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I evolved a lot in the course of doing this project. I've never been a fan of capital punishment, so I didn't evolve in that way. I just don't feel from a moral point of view that it's a great idea for societies to be doing that. But what changed is I went into this project with all sorts of ideas about how lynching and which is the extra legal, the illegal murdering of especially African Americans in the South, how that was going to interact with the legal execution, where it goes through a court system and someone is sentenced to death and the sheriff is there performing the execution and all of that. And I had ideas about how they would really be parallel kinds of things. They're mostly African Americans in the South who are being executed legally, as well as being lynched illegally. And my sense was they were probably white crowds. They were probably, that this was sort of an extra punishment to make it in public, and that kind of a thing. So those were my ideas. And those were the ideas that were largely in the scholarship that I was reading. And the way that historians talked about it is, look at how similar these two things are. But that's not what I found. So I went on quite a journey, and the journey that I took was largely due to the sources. This is the kind of project, I think of it as a sort of project of discovery. So it's not that I was looking at what people have already done and just adding a little bit to it. It's that I was going in depth into primary sources, into newspapers. It's based on 1,300 newspaper reports of executions in the South from the 1860s to the 1930s. And what I found is these weren't like lynchings. And so that just made it really interesting to me, and changed the course of what I was writing and what the book is about.
Do you think it's also a popular history / popular culture thing where we see the post-Civil War years and we think of lynching as being prevalent, and it's just everywhere, and it's violent, obviously, and it's occurring in almost every corner of the South before it becomes the New South? Do you think it's also a popular culture thing for us, where we're seeing it through the lens of what we see on the screen instead of the lens of the primary source?
Yes, except I think it's a little more complicated than that. So I agree that lynching is disgusting, right? Right. So it's just sort of, whenever there's a lynching in a story, in a novel, in a movie, and it's just
right.
so horrifying that it sort of sucks the oxygen out of the room. And so that sort of a dynamic certainly does mean that in our sort of popular imagination, it has a very prominent and very important place. But it's more than that, in that the public executions, let me see if I can say this succinctly, the public executions that historians have looked at the most are the ones that left the biggest trail in the historical record. Why did they leave the biggest trail? Because they were the most conflictual, because they were the most violent, or the most like a lynching, the most disturbing. And so in even the historical record, and if you were to read, scholars of the late 19th century South, if they come across, or if they talk about a public execution, it's very likely to be an example in which things are going wrong, in which the crowd is really boisterous and they're tearing down things and whatever. It's a moment of violence. And so that also colors, it colored my view of what this was going to be when I got into this project. Because, like I said, I thought it was going to be like a lynching, and it isn't. So can I take a minute and just say what the typical public execution looked like?
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question.
Okay, great.
What is that? What does a legal
Yeah.
execution in this 70-year span look
Yeah.
like if it doesn't look like that?
Yeah. So the lynchings, of course, just to make sure that we're on the same page, are white people largely, not officially, it's illegal, wresting somebody out of the judicial system, and either for social, it doesn't have to be a crime. It could be socially not backing down to the white people around them. Or if they've committed a crime, they just wrest them out of the legal system and they kill them. It can be at the stake, all kinds of gross things. Usually it was a hanging. A legal execution, a public legal execution in like 1870, and all of the executions in the South around that time are public executions. It's the next generation that starts making them private. Would be out in a field. And often they would be described as a natural amphitheater. I mean, these are positions that are designed for viewing. And whoever wants to can come. I mean, it's just an open field. There's going to be, the scaffold, and there's going to be a sort of event there at the scaffold. And who came? White men, white women, children, black men, black women in the South. So these are mixed race, mixed gender, huge crowds. So in a county, a rural county, maybe you have 3,000 people there. There's going to be one of the largest crowds any of these people have ever been in. And so that's really interesting. Is it dominated by white people on the scaffold? It isn't. So that's how it's different from a lynching. And this is what surprised me as I was doing the research, is that in time after time reading these reports, they're saying things about the crowd being as black as it is white. So it's not just white people who are there, sometimes a majority. And who is on the scaffold? The condemned. And well over 80% of the condemned in the South are black men. And his minister. This is a moment when he's going to go meet his maker, and in a Christian society like the South was, you need to have a minister there to minister unto you in your last moments. In the antebellum period, under slavery, it would have been a white man. One of the first things that happens after the Civil War is African Americans form their own churches and get out of those white churches. And so now it's a black man. And so you have a black man being executed, and who is confessing his sins, whether he did this crime or not. They sometimes confess the crime. I drank too much, don't drink, and sometimes they say, I didn't do this crime, but I'm a sinner. We're all sinners. Here are my sins. They confess. And a black minister leading the crowd in hymns, prayers. And then the black man almost always says something like, I'll see you all in heaven. So this guy committed murder, maybe, or convicted of a murder anyway, or a rape. And he's now being executed publicly in front of blacks and whites in the era of Jim Crow, with him saying, "I'll see you all in heaven." So that's really different dynamic. It's from lynching, or from what a white supremacist Southern state would want out of a punishment regime. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that was the interesting part, that I was finding something that was really different than what I expected to find, or that people had been talking about before.
Yeah, when I read that, I was really struck with the fact that this is probably one of the largest desegregated gatherings this
Right.
county would ever see. You know.
Right. And so as things are really getting segregated, and of course, education, freedmen schools, that's already segregated, and churches are now segregated, amusements are segregated. Even if you went to the Virginia State Fair, it would be white people on most days, and then African Americans going on the African American day to the state fair. So everything's getting segregated. But these crowds, public execution crowds in the 1870s and 80s, would be huge, desegregated crowds, with so much of the focus on African American men who are claiming the authority of religion. Yeah. So that makes it even more of a sort of a conflict with the white state that wanted, what did they want? They wanted it to be a sort of chastening ritual, in which the underclass would be thinking, I can't step out of line, or else something like this would happen to me. But instead, you've got, this guy's committed to Christ, and the enfolding arms of the Lord are going to, a very different message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost become it's a message of salvation, going home, sort of
Yeah.
thing, and I'm sure that wasn't what some people had in mind, which we'll get to
Yeah.
later. But what was the activity within that crowd? Was the crowd boisterous? Was the crowd subdued? I mean, I'm sure it depends on the case or the person,
Yeah.
etc. But it's really interesting to think of a couple thousand people just in this kind of like an amphitheater like field. And are they just standing there? Are they making their own kinds of thoughts about religion at the same time with the condemned? What's going on in the crowd?
Yeah. So I liked what you said. Both the question is a really good one, but then also you were saying, I guess it's really different in different places. So let me just stick on that for just a second. The South has 1,200 counties, and for, just as many sheriffs who are controlling things in different ways or not. The crimes can be different. The sort of public outcry can be different depending on the crime. And so you're right, there's a whole variety of things. And in one of my chapters, I look at the ones that are in fact really disorderly, that are more like a lynching, because there are some where it's really hard to determine, how is this in reality different from a lynching. But there are very few of those, really. It's just about a dozen cases that I found. The norm would be a crowd that in fact is being sought after by local merchants. So along the way toward the gallows, there might be stands set up to sell lemonade or, barbecue or something. Sometimes a more formal kind of entertainment joins in. So somebody's trying to make money by setting up a local dance hall for that night or something, making it a social event. But the crowd, while it's happening, is often in these reports spoken of as joining in with the hymns that are being sung. And so it's almost like a congregation. And there are many, many times during the event, the reports say that people are, as if it's a camp meeting, as if it's an evangelical religious revival, that they're speaking out and saying, "Amen, brother," and sort of sometimes rolling around on the floor as if, being overtaken by the Spirit, like can happen in an evangelical camp meeting.
Mhm.
And so the sort of religious element is emphasized by the activity of the crowd.
Mhm. Mhm. How do the white populations within these areas react to this kind of religious expression?
Yeah.
Because I, even where I grew up, I heard people say, "Well, if you go to the black church with your friends, you're not going to be just be sitting there." And it's
Yeah.
like they didn't understand, the different ways uh, of having that expression in religion at
Yeah.
that time. Even where I grew up, and even when I grew up, it was a
Yeah. Yeah.
different way of thinking about it. How did Southerners, white Southerners, see these kinds of interactions with religion when they're at these kinds of events? Did they
Yeah.
speak about
That's,
it in the newspapers a lot, or what was happening?
I missed that last part.
Did they speak about, like, in the newspapers? It's kind of like, well, look at how they are reacting to
Oh,
this
yeah. Yeah.
event, and
Yeah.
etc.
So class matters there as well as
Mm,
race. So
mhm,
did the whites look down upon this sort of emotional expression in Black religion? Absolutely. And did the white papers that I saw sometimes they just um, sometimes they seem to admire it actually, and other times it depends on the editor and the paper and the situation and so forth. But sometimes they seem pretty insulting about it. So you definitely get that in the newspaper coverage. Um, but the middle class white religion was very straight laced, but poor white religion was also evangelical and could
mhm,
include calling out. And
mhm, right.
you go into rural South today, and there's plenty of active
Mhm,
churches that are white churches, evangelical churches. So in
right.
that way, class really matters. And African American middle class congregations, which there weren't a whole lot of them, but in
Mhm,
cities there would be a middle class population enough to have one church that's more, learned or something,
mhm,
that had much calmer ceremonies and stuff. They look down, the middle class in the Black community look down on the emotional release
mhm,
elements of the African American religion. And we're saying basically, you're making us look bad,
mhm,
and so forth. So class matters almost as much as religion does. I mean, as much as race does.
mhm. Yeah, I often wondered why some of my family would say that to me about, going to a service with my black friends, because I'm like, we are Appalachian pig farmers. Okay. We're not in the middle class really at this time. Why are we worried about this? But it was a different issue altogether, which I grew up in a area full of basically prejudice and hatred, and I've always wanted to be better than that. And that's
Yeah.
why I think it's very important to read these kinds of books like you are bringing out. Um, with these kinds of ideas of salvation and crying out to God for salvation and please take this person's soul into his arms, et cetera, et cetera. Is that why some of these events become indoor events? Excuse me, because it's almost like from the white sider's point of view, our message isn't getting across,
Yeah.
and we need to fight back against that. Is this all white supremacy coming back again and saying, okay, we're not getting our message across. We'll make it get across, and we're going to shut everybody out. Is that why it goes indoors?
You're saying that well, and that's definitely what I was finding. So with that, I moved from looking at these reports of cases to looking at the legislative journals and the moments when the laws actually changed, and what were editorial writers in the paper saying at those moments, and that sort of a thing. That gave me an avenue to understand the thinking behind the changes in the law in the South having to do with punishment in this moment. And so what I was finding is they were saying this isn't terrorizing enough. And so what you want is it to be chastening and so forth. And instead, it's just a hallelujah circus, is sort of the way that they would characterize it. A lot of talk of disorder. And occasionally there was disorder, fights would break out or whatever. But a lot of it was the disorder of the emotionalism of religion, of Black religion in these moments. And so state after state at different moments from the late 1870s all the way into the 1920s in the South, every one of them moved away from public execution and into having execution behind a wall. And eventually, every one of them moves from hangings to electrocution. And that's going to be in the bowels of a penitentiary. It's going to be completely away from crowds.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a wall of any sort, you're making decisions about who can come inside that barrier. And once you're making those decisions, you've got a sheriff who can say, okay, we're going to have a white doctor who's there to oversee things. The newspaper editors can come, or newspaper reporters. We want the lawyers from both sides or whatever. And that's going to be our audience. We're going to have a professional audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that phrase was used at the time. And so that just changes the nature of it. And definitely the impulse was to make it more scary by making it more secret, silent, somber, and to cut out all of this I'm going to heaven talk.
Mm-hmm.
It strips away African-American authority that was in public in front of whites and blacks in an era in which Jim Crow segregation is being retrenched. So this is another piece of that kind of story.
Mm. It's almost like what we have seen in the modern era with the secrecy or this kind of like aura of secrecy around our modern day capital punishment. It's kind of like I thought about that going through it. It's almost like a line you can draw where we've heard people who have seen bad executions, like executions go wrong, you know, and for some people, all executions are bad, but when it goes not according to plan, and they're the ones that are sensationalized and impressed because of obvious reasons. This person probably suffered, et cetera, guilty or not. And I saw that in this book from some of the accounts you said from, I believe, some of the SB file stuff and everything, where it seemed like a lot of the sensationalism and a lot of the ideas that bring about this kind of let's move indoors comes from the press and saying, well, this isn't working, is it? Because look at what you're creating, and they're making columns of text about this, right? And it kind of is like, yeah, we got to change it up a little bit.
That's right. And the sort of general view before the view that I had before I started looking at these primary sources, and the one that is the way that people have talked about this change from public to private in like New England and other parts of the country, is that it's a civilizing process, that as the middle class grew, it became disgusting to them to have this sort of public, what seems like public torture moment in view of the whole society, and then it coarsens society and so forth. And so that's sort of what I was thinking I was going to get. What I got instead were, as you say, all these columns that were talking about secrecy in a very different way, not let's make things calmer and more middle class decorous or whatever, but instead let's make the underclass fear this even more. A phrase that I use as a chapter title: make it a secret silent monster. That then will terrorize the underclass more effectively than these hallelujah moments have been. And so the media element of this is I think you're right, really an important piece of it. They're sort of framing the conversation, as the media does, then and now, framing the conversation that we're having about public issues like punishment and what the most effective punishment is.
Yeah, I also thought of when I was going through the book, I was thinking of C. Van Woodward saying that the New South is built upon contradictions, and I was like, okay, here's another one.
Yeah, that's right.
It seems like it, and I was like you, probably when you first started to research it, me not reading the book yet, and then I read the book. You not doing the research beforehand, and then diving into the research for a number of years. I saw it backwards. And it was like, that was my own contradiction where I was like, wait a minute. Okay, here's another one. And I thought of Woodward right away when I was reading through that. Did those kind of ideas cross your mind too when you were looking at the SB file or these newspaper accounts or magazine accounts of this stuff? Was it another kind of notch where it's like, wow, we still have a little bit more to learn about these cultural shifts?
Yeah, I think so. And there were a number of things that were like that. For instance, I found that the people that I could identify as Republican legislators were less enthusiastic about putting executions behind walls than were Democrats. That I didn't know that I was going to find, and seemed to be okay. I got another little piece of evidence that something interesting is going on here. You do get people talking about civility in the South, but at the same time, you have other people talking about terrorism. So you've got that sort of in the wider history of this era of progressivism, the South was very progressive in some ways, and then in other ways, really not. And so again, this is another example of that kind of thing. And as I say, the sort of most surprising part of it to me that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out and actually reshape the project over the course of the span that I was working on it is the religion element, where I thought it was a certain thing, and then it really I was convinced is something else. So it's a object lesson for me of how important it is to get back into the materials of the time, because our preconceptions that we take back aren't necessarily the best guide to what's in essence a foreign country, the past.
Yeah, that's a major thing I'm trying to get across to a lot of young historians and even historians who've been in the game, so to speak, for a while, is that generalities usually are incorrect, except when
Yeah,
we say, lynchings are terrible. Yes, we can make that generality. That's fine. But why someone is being lynched or how this is
yeah,
happening is a totally different thing.
yeah,
And that was something else that I wanted to point out to my listeners, was the fact that it wasn't people weren't just executed for murder, and this is different too, almost state to state. What were some other reasons why some people would end up being executed in the South during this time?
yeah. So most states, there's some states that have no capital punishment at all in America now, and in America then, some very northern states. But of the states that do, north and south and west, usually states limit it to murder and treason. And treason is never really, and is anyone executed for that. So it's really murder. And in the South, murder is the largest category. So most people are executed for the crime of murder. But it's not just murder in the South. And that's something that makes the South distinctive from the rest of the nation. As of the early part of the 20th century, every state in the South executed people for the crime of rape. And that was very unusual outside of the South. And a few of them even for attempted rape, which is extraordinarily like no one else outside of the South does that. And there are other ones, and you're right, it's state by state. These are all state criminal laws. We don't have a national set of criminal laws for the most part. And so you've got burglary, robbery, arson, and a few other crimes that could, and it's usually a choice that the jury has. Can I stay with that for a minute and explain what I mean there?
Sure, absolutely.
So in the code of the South, the legal code of the South before the Civil War, you'd have one code for whites and one code for free blacks and one code for enslaved Americans. And the whites might have for rape or for robbery or something a term in a penitentiary. For African Americans, both free and slave, it might be death or transportation out of state if you're a slave, because they often like to do that better. With the constitutional amendments after the Civil War, you couldn't have 3 different criminal codes. You had to have one. And so what they did is they didn't simply make the white one apply to everyone. They broadened the scope of punishments and put it in the hands of the jury. And so you've got, for burglary in Virginia, say, from 7 to 17 years or death. And then the jury decides how to give that punishment. And it would be white people getting a term in prison and black people sometimes getting a term in prison and sometimes death. And so with the South, you have murder mostly, but then a pretty good sized number of rape and attempted rape cases, and then a few other ones, which were pretty rare to have actual executions, but they're on the books in a variety of states. This just goes to show another way that the South has been at the center of capital punishment discussions for 200 years. I mean, for its population, it had a disproportionate number of executions in the 1840s and 50s, much less the late 19th century, much less now. I mean, today, Texas, the whole rest of the country doesn't execute as much as Texas does, and the rest of the South as well.
Do you think we can, as historians in the modern sense, can we draw parallels between that post-Civil War idea of leaving it to the jury to decide this sentencing and our modern day, systematic trouble with sentencing? I mean, is it go back to that kind of post-Civil War 1866, whenever kind of idea? And I know this wasn't in the book, but do you think it has that parallel kind of travel where we can link these two things and say, this is why, and not just in the South, but nationwide even?
Yeah, right. That's interesting. And I think I'll push back against that a little bit, though, only to sort of refine the terms a bit. So in terms of capital punishment, the South was on the cutting edge in terms of this sort of expanding the role of the jury. And it was mostly a tactic by which they could assign penalties according to things other than the actual crime, who the person is. And so even in the case of murder, Virginia and other states expanded it from being death as the penalty to death or a term in the pen. And so there again, you've got, even for murder, a sort of decision that ultimately white jurors, very few black jurors after 1880 in the South, are going to be making. So that's a sort of innovation to sort of recreate the kind of control over life and death and that part of punishment that we had before, the Southerners are saying to themselves. And so I think that's a little bit different than the 3 strikes you're out, going to prison, or, the sort of convolution of the way that we do capital punishment cases since the 1970s. There are developments that happen in that history in the mid and late 20th century that definitely make things very complicated. And so I can see how you would draw that connection. But I think historically it's a sort of a different dynamic. We got rid of capital punishment for a few years in the early 70s. The Supreme Court said that it was cruel and unusual punishment the way that we were doing it. The recreation of capital punishment in 1976 and after that in a variety of Southern states particularly is its own development, and is a part of an era of tremendous fear of crime, rising crime rates in the 60s and 70s, rising penitentiary rates, imprisonment rates, with the war on drugs and everything. It's a part of an era of conservative backlash, but also a lot of fear about public safety and so forth. And so I think that's its own kind of moment.
I appreciate the pushback, because I want to learn. This is how I learn. And it makes me think about things differently. Each time I speak to an author and it's like, okay, I didn't think of it that way. That's great. And that's why I tell people, just please keep reading. When was basically I don't want to use the term the climax of this kind of movement, but when was the kind of like this where you see the pinnacle of, and I hate to use that even too, when we see the most use of the legal execution in the South? When was that happening? Because we talk about it so much in the modern era, but yet we're not even close to what
Oh,
was
not
going
even
on
close.
back
Yeah,
then.
absolutely. And some people talk about it as being really high during the Great Depression, and it was in terms of numbers, but in terms of the proportion of the population, you know, as populations rise, everything rises. You know, how much food everybody's eating rises.
Right.
Crimes are going to rise along with populations. Therefore, punishments are going to rise along. So you have to sort of take that into account when you're looking at what is the high spot. If you have twice as many people in the 1940s than you had in 1890, then just looking at the numbers doesn't really tell you much of anything.
Mm.
And so the high point of capital punishment in the history of the U.S. South, at least after the Civil War, is in the 1880s and the 1890s, and it declines after that. It doesn't decline sharply, it declines gradually. But that's also something that in the scholarship we had a really mixed messages about, because a number of people knew that there was a high point of lynching in the early 1890s, and then it fell after that. But one sort of latent story that kept being told was that lynchings went down and executions went up. And that in some way there was a sort of trade-off of legal executions for lynchings. Well, I find that they both went down.
Mm.
They're both going down at the same time. The high point of public executions is probably the 1880s, and it's in the 1880s and the 1890s that so many of the southern states are making these transitions to having greater control over how these events are happening,
Mhm.
and getting rid of the African American public authority on the scaffold. So those all sort of parallel that the late 19th century saw a moment in which these things were really prominent and then started moving away from that.
Mm. Michael, what do you want the reader to take away from your book? What's the main theme that you want them to remember when they move forward?
Well, what I love for all readers of history to take away from all history is an understanding of just how weird and nuanced and complicated our past is. And
Just
so
like us.
to me, this is a little bit of an example of that, how we thought we were looking at a certain thing, the sort of imposition of white authority on blacks. And in fact, it's a moment of religious expression. It's much more of a contested terrain and so forth. The other thing is that change is going to happen in our lives. We certainly have issues with justice and race that are very much present.
Mhm.
And we have a lot of frustration on the part of especially young Americans that things are not changing fast enough in terms of social justice and otherwise. And looking at the past, you have to see, the past forces you to see that whether you want it to or not, things are going to change. They can change for the worse sometimes, but they can change for the better, but they're not going to be the same. And so we have issues right now. I'm flabbergasted that we haven't done a better job of having our prison system be more sane in terms of trying to help people not commit crimes and recommit crimes when they come out of the system and so forth. We're just not good at this. That's an issue that's been around forever, but that's different than an issue of an era of lynching,
Mhm.
which we had back in the, I mean, that's different.
Right.
And so things change. And I think history is the great teacher in terms of that.
Mm. So what's next for you, Michael? Do you have something else in the works?
Thanks for asking. And I have to say, the key thing for me is that it not have to do with death. The
There
first
you
book had to do with sensation and murder cases. This one
go.
had to do with a very dark topic of capital punishment.
Mhm.
And I'm working on an article that's on American cash, on
Mhm.
actual coins and paper money, and how at different times, because of the gold standard and so forth, our money just kind of went away. And we had to, you just could not find coins to use. And so there are interesting stories to tell there that have to do with the weirdness of 19th century history, but not having to do with death.
There you go. A little bit more lighthearted
Yeah,
than.
a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Cash has some dirty stuff too, but not
Yeah,
like
yeah, it
not
does.
like this. Not like
Not
this.
like this. Yeah,
No, but I really enjoyed your book, Michael. It really made me think about things in a new way with Crime and Punishment, and I had some of the same kind of, I guess, prejudices going into this book of thinking about what I was going to see from executions,
sure.
and to know that as a historian, but also as a person reading these kinds of books, it really makes me see that we're forever a student, even though we
Yeah,
call ourselves historians. We're forever students.
yeah. And the book, as I originally envisioned it, is not the book that I ended up writing.
Mm,
And things change on you. And I think one of the things as a historian that you have to be okay with is the closer you look at something, the more complicated it becomes,
mhm.
and that you need to adjust your ideas, and be willing to get rid of some of those preconceptions you have, when the evidence does not, in fact, support them.
It's true. History doesn't fit on a meme.
No, it doesn't,
we
not very easily.
we've tried, but it
Yeah.
doesn't work that way. No, but Michael, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate the conversation, and again, I admire your work, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.